Part 8: The Post-Corporate Transition District. The Civilizational Argument. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. May 29, 2026. Part 8: The Civilizational Argument. Chapter 38. What globally recognized actually means. The phrase global recognition is one of the most abused designations in the contemporary vocabulary of institutional ambition, having been applied with such promiscuous generosity to such a vast range of organizations, initiatives, programs, brands, and cultural projects that have achieved varying and frequently modest degrees of actual global awareness that the phrase has largely lost its capacity to communicate anything more specific than the institution's aspiration to be taken seriously by audiences beyond its immediate geographic vicinity. The conference that describes itself as globally recognized because its proceedings are downloadable from a website accessible in multiple countries. The co-working space that describes itself as globally recognized because its Instagram account has followers on 4 continents. The intentional community that describes itself as globally recognized because a profile in a medium circulation lifestyle magazine reached some readers who do not live in the community's immediate vicinity. These are not instances of global recognition in any operationally meaningful sense. They are instances of the aspiration to global recognition expressed through the self-application of the designation that the aspiration is directed toward, in the specific cultural dynamic through which the designation's inflationary deployment eventually strips it of the precise meaning that makes it strategically valuable to the communities whose genuine achievement of the condition it was originally designed to describe. This handbook is making a specific and precise claim to global recognition for the Aldea Zamá transition district, a claim that is not the aspirational self-application of a desired designation but the specific description of a specific condition that the second phase strategy is designed to produce through the specific mechanisms that the preceding parts of the handbook have established in operational detail. The precision of the claim requires the precision of the definition, the specific delineation of what global recognition means in the specific context of the transition district's civilizational project, and what it does not mean, and why the distinction between the genuine condition and its aspirational approximations is consequential rather than merely semantic for the strategic purposes the global recognition is designed to serve. Global recognition, in the specific sense this handbook intends, means the specific condition in which the transition district model, the specific institutional form of the post-corporate transition district as this handbook has defined and operationally specified it, is the primary reference point in the global intellectual and cultural discourse about what a post-corporate transition district is, what it requires, and what it produces, such that every subsequent development that presents itself as an instance of this model is positioned in relation to the Aldea Zamá community's founding instance rather than to any independently established alternative definition of the model's essential character. Global recognition, in this specific sense, is the condition of the conceptual founding. The condition of the community that has not merely built an impressive instance of a pre-existing model, but has defined the model itself through the intellectual territorial capture that Part 5's treatment of publishing as territorial capture established as the primary mechanism of the transition district's civilizational authority. The globally recognized transition district is not the most famous transition district. Fame is a consequence of global recognition in this sense, not its definition. It is the definitionally primary instance, the instance from which the definition of the category is derived, and against which every other claimed instance of the category is evaluated. This is a significantly more demanding condition than the aspirational self-application of the globally recognized designation implies, and its demandingness is precisely what makes it strategically valuable rather than merely flattering. The community that achieves the designation ally primary position in a new institutional category achieves it not through the largest marketing budget, or the most impressive physical facilities, or the most visible founding members, all of which are resources that competitors with access to adequate capital can replicate, but through the specific quality of the intellectual territorial capture that the publishing strategies governing vocabulary establishes and the specific quality of the operational demonstration that the social proof infrastructure's 5 layers document. These are resources that capital cannot replicate in the form that makes them genuinely category defining, because the intellectual territorial capture requires the specific quality of genuinely first, genuinely honest, and genuinely comprehensive engagement with the model's essential character that the subsequent publications, however well-resourced, can only engage with in relation to rather than independently of. The first publication that comprehensively defines the governing vocabulary of a new institutional form is the publication that every subsequent publication about the same institutional form must either cite, extend, or contest, and the citation, the extension, and the contestation are all forms of acknowledgement of the definitional primacy that the first publication has established through its prior and comprehensive engagement with the model's essential character. The strategic value of the globally recognized designation in the specific sense this chapter has defined it operates through 5 specific mechanisms, each of which serves a different function in the transition district's second phase strategy, and each of which is enabled by the specific quality of the definitional primacy rather than the mere familiarity that the aspirational self-application of the designation describes. The first mechanism is the quality filtering of arriving practitioners. The globally recognized transition district, the community whose definitional primacy in the post-corporate transition district category has been established through the intellectual territorial capture of the model's governing vocabulary and the operational demonstration of the model's genuine practice, attracts a qualitatively different class of arriving practitioners than the community whose recognition is primarily local or regional or aspirational. The qualitative difference is not primarily a difference in the practitioner's prior achievements or their institutional credentials or their economic resources, all of which are easily misread as the primary indicators of practitioner quality in communities whose assessment of practitioner quality is organized around the conventional markers of professional distinction. The qualitative difference is a difference in the practitioner's specific relationship to the community's governing framework. The difference between the practitioners who arrive because the community's specific governing vocabulary has articulated something they have been attempting to understand and practice without the conceptual infrastructure that the vocabulary provides, and the practitioners who arrive because the community has achieved a level of general cultural visibility that makes it appealing as a destination for the broad range of aspirations that general cultural visibility attracts. The first class of arriving practitioners, the practitioners who have been specifically drawn by the governing vocabulary's specific articulation of what they have been attempting, are the practitioners whose engagement with the community's program is most likely to be the specific, committed, operationally serious engagement that the community's knowledge transmission function and the community's cultural production ecosystem require as their primary human resources. The second class, the practitioners drawn by general cultural visibility, is a more heterogeneous population whose engagement with the community's program is more likely to be the partial, provisional, conditionally committed engagement that the community's atmospheric reception phase is designed to accommodate, but that the community's knowledge transmission function and cultural production ecosystem cannot rely on as their primary resources. The second mechanism is the stakeholder confidence generation. The globally recognized transition district enjoys a specific quality of property stakeholder confidence that the locally recognized or aspirationally recognized community does not have access to. The confidence that derives from the stakeholders' awareness that the community's governing model has been recognized by the global audiences whose recognition is most meaningful as evidence of the model's genuine cultural and intellectual authority. The property stakeholder who is negotiating the experimental accommodation model's expansion from the pilot activation node's initial arrangement to the larger and more institutionally significant arrangements that the second phase program's full development period requires is making a progressively larger commitment to the community's ongoing presence in the development's physical infrastructure, a commitment whose terms are more favorable to the community the more confident the stakeholder is that the community's governing model is not merely locally interesting but globally relevant. The global recognition provides the specific quality of the stakeholders' confidence in the community's global relevance that the local and aspirational recognition cannot provide, because the global recognition is not the community's self-assessment of its own global relevance, but the external validation of the global audiences whose independent recognition of the community's governing model is the most credible possible evidence of the relevance's genuine character. The third mechanism is the replication incentive production. The globally recognized transition district creates the specific conditions under which the replication of the transition district model in other geographies is most likely to be both attempted and successful. Conditions that the locally recognized or aspirationally recognized community cannot create because its recognition has not established the definitional primacy that makes the model available for replication rather than requiring independent reinvention in each new geographic context. The replication incentive is the specific combination of the model's demonstrated viability, the model's established governing vocabulary, and the model's globally recognized definitional primacy that together make the attempt to instantiate the model in a new geographic context a genuinely rational strategic investment rather than the speculative cultural experiment that the model's first instantiation in Aldea Zamá represents. The globally recognized community that has produced the replication incentive is the community that has converted its own specific historical situation, the specific convergence of the liminal district, the founding cohort, the governing vocabulary, and the civilizational moment that made the first instantiation possible, into the specific organizational template that makes comparable instantiations in comparable situations possible without requiring each subsequent instantiation to recapitulate the entire process of the model's original development from its conceptual foundations. The template is the model's most durable strategic contribution to the civilization it is prototyping, the specific form of the model's generativity that converts the individual community's local achievement into the broader civilizational infrastructure that the governing framework has identified as the transition district's most ambitious and most consequential long-term objective. The fourth mechanism is the intellectual authority maintenance. The globally recognized transition district maintains the specific quality of intellectual authority over the model's ongoing definition and development that the definitional primacy provides, the authority to determine what the model is, what it requires, what it produces, and what distinguishes the genuine instance of the model from the imitation that adopts the model's vocabulary without the model's essential organizational characteristics. This authority is not a formal certification authority. The transition district's governing framework has explicitly rejected the proprietary control of the model's vocabulary as the instrument of the intellectual territorial capture in favor of the open source quality of the territorial capture that makes the vocabulary available for use and extension while maintaining the community's standing as the definitional primary instance. The intellectual authority is therefore the authority of genuine priority and genuine quality rather than the authority of legal instrument. The specific quality of the community's ongoing intellectual and creative engagement with the model's development that makes the community's judgments about the model's essential character the most credible and the most authoritative available in the global intellectual discourse about the post-corporate transition district's nature and possibilities. The intellectual authority is maintained through the continuous publication of the governing vocabulary's extensions and the continuous demonstration of the model's operational validity. The two activities that together ensure the community's engagement with the model's development remains the most comprehensive and the most honest available, rather than being superseded by the subsequent publications of communities whose engagement with the model's development, however well-resourced, cannot claim the specific combination of prior priority and genuine operational grounding that the definitional primacy requires. The fifth mechanism is the civilizational legacy production. The globally recognized transition district produces a specific quality of civilizational legacy that the locally recognized or aspirationally recognized community cannot produce, the legacy of the definitionally primary instance of a new institutional form that the civilization produced in response to a specific and historically significant challenge. The civilizational legacy is not the mere historical record of the community's operation. Every community that operates for sufficient time produces a historical record of some description. The civilizational legacy is the specific quality of the community's contribution to the civilization's total organizational repertoire, the specific addition to the inventory of institutional forms that human civilization has available for the organization of human activity in the specific conditions that the civilizational moment makes most urgently requiring of new institutional forms. The transition district's civilizational legacy is the specific contribution of the post-corporate transition district model to the civilization's organizational repertoire, the specific institutional form that the civilization developed, in the specific conditions of the AI displacement wave and the post-institutional identity dissolution and the liminal architecture of the Tulum corridor's Aldea Zamá, for the specific challenge of supporting the post-institutional transition of the displaced professional class whose accumulated operational knowledge and genuine productive capacity the civilization urgently requires to be preserved, developed, and redeployed in the service of the civilization's own continued development rather than depleted through the specific psychological and operational damage that the unsupported transition consistently produces. The globally recognized designation, in this specific and operationally precise sense, is therefore not a marketing achievement or a social media milestone or a conference keynote invitation. It is the specific condition of the community's genuine contribution to the civilization's organizational repertoire, demonstrated through the intellectual territorial capture of the model's governing vocabulary, the operational demonstration of the model's genuine practice, and the social proof. Infrastructure's accumulated documentation of the model's genuine cultural and human value. The designation is earned through the specific quality of the genuine engagement with the model's essential character that the preceding parts of this handbook have established as the transition district's governing framework, earned through the Monday briefing's cognitive synchronization and the Tuesday session's sovereign publishing production and the Wednesday night's mythological development and the Thursday dinner's honest knowledge transfer and the Friday stress tests operational honesty and the Saturday atmosphere night's territorial activation and the Sunday integration's genuine cognitive development, practiced week after week and generation after generation in the specific physical territory of the specific liminal district by the specific community of practitioners whose genuine engagement with the governing framework makes the designation not the community's aspiration but its achieved condition. The distinction between the aspiration and the achieved condition is the distinction this chapter was written to establish, and the establishment is not merely definitional, it is strategic, because the specific mechanisms through which the globally recognized designation serves the transition district's second phase strategy are mechanisms that only the achieved condition activates, not the aspiration toward it. The stakeholders' confidence is not generated by the community's aspiration to global recognition. It is generated by the community's genuine achievement of the definitional primacy that the governing vocabulary's intellectual territorial capture and the social proof infrastructure's documented demonstration together produce. The quality filtering of arriving practitioners is not produced by the community's aspiration to attract high-quality practitioners. It is produced by the community's genuine achievement of the specific quality of intellectual and operational engagement with the post-corporate transition's essential challenges that attracts the practitioners whose own genuine engagement with those challenges is most specifically prepared by the community's governing vocabulary. And the replication incentive that the globally recognized designation enables is not produced by the community's aspiration to have its model replicated. It is produced by the community's genuine achievement of the operational demonstration that makes the model's replication in other geographic contexts a rational strategic investment rather than a speculative cultural experiment. The achieved condition of global recognition is what this handbook's entire intellectual architecture is designed to produce, through the governing vocabulary's intellectual territorial capture, through the weekly metabolism's operational demonstration, through the architecture of arrival's community formation, through the myth infrastructure's civilizational imagination, through the stakeholder conversation's social proof generation, and through the guild model's recursive stability. The designation is the destination. The handbook is the map. The community's genuine practice is the journey. And the journey's end, the specific achieved condition of the first globally recognized post-corporate transition district in the history of human settlements built for the civilization that comes after the one that just stopped honoring its contracts, is not farther away than the governing framework's genuine practice can reach from the specific starting point of the specific community in the specific territory at the specific historical moment where the practice begins. The window is open. The practice is beginning. The recognition is not a destination beyond the journey's horizon. It is the natural consequence of the journey's genuine completion, achievable in the specific time frame that the seeding phase's establishment and the stakeholder conversation's first agreements and the recursive stability's 4 cycles initial operation together make possible, and documented with the specific quality of the honest, accumulated, globally circulable evidence that the social proof infrastructure's 5 layers are designed to produce across the community's sustained genuine practice. The globally recognized designation is earned. It is earned through genuine practice. The genuine practice is what this handbook is a blueprint for. And the blueprint, as this chapter's analysis of the globally recognized designation's specific mechanisms has established, is itself the first act of the recognition's achievement, the first publication of the governing vocabulary that initiates the intellectual territorial capture from which the definitional primacy and the category founding authority and the civilizational legacy production all ultimately derive. The designation is earned by what you do and how honestly you document what you do and how comprehensively you publish what you have learned about what you do and why it matters. The handbook is the comprehensive publication. The community's practice is the honest documentation source. The global recognition is the consequence of the source's genuine quality producing the comprehensive publication's genuine authority. The authority is the designation. The designation is what this chapter has been defining with the specific operational precision that the transition district's second phase strategy requires the designation to have before the strategy can make productive use of it. And now that the definition is established in the specific operational precision this chapter has developed, the argument can proceed to the question of what the designation's achievement means not only for the Aldea Zamá community that achieves it first but for every community that follows, the question that is the subject of the chapter that follows. Part 8. The Civilizational Argument Chapter 39. The Prototype and the Pattern. The relationship between the prototype and the pattern is the relationship between the first instance of a new form and the form's subsequent availability as a template for the production of further instances. The relationship between the specific, historically situated, irreplaceably particular achievement of the first and the general, transmissible, replicable organizational knowledge that the first achievement makes available to every subsequent attempt to achieve something comparable in different conditions. This relationship is the most important dimension of the transition district's civilizational argument, and it is the dimension that distinguishes the governing framework's claim about the Aldea Zamá community's significance from the mere local claim of a community that has achieved something valuable for its specific members in its specific place at its specific historical moment. A claim that, however genuinely the value is achieved, does not rise to the level of the civilizational argument that this handbook's title proposes and that this chapter is concerned with establishing in its full operational specificity. The prototype is specific in ways that the pattern is not. The prototype is built in a specific place by specific people, with the specific materials and the specific skills and the specific convergence of conditions that the specific historical moment makes available. The Aldea Zamá community's second phase development is a prototype in this specific sense. It is being built in the specific liminal district of Aldea Zamá by the specific founding cohort of practitioners whose specific convergence in this specific geography at this specific moment in the intersection of the AI displacement wave and the Tulum corridor's post-speculative recalibration is the specific historical condition that makes the specific instantiation of the transition district model possible in the specific form that this handbook has been developing. The prototype specificity is not a limitation. It is the source of the prototype's genuine authority as the founding instance of the model, the specific quality of the irreplaceable particular that gives the prototype its cultural standing as the definitionally primary instance from which the pattern is derived rather than as the generic implementation of a general design that any adequately resourced organization could have produced. The prototype matters because it is specific, because it is first, and because the specific historical conditions that made it possible are conditions that will not recur in their specific combination. Conditions that make the founding instance a genuinely unique historical achievement rather than merely the first of many equally achievable instances of the same model. The pattern, by contrast, is general in ways that the prototype is not. The pattern is the specific organizational knowledge extracted from the prototype's specific achievement, the knowledge of what the specific achievement required, what it produced, what failure modes it encountered and how it addressed them, and what the specific combination of design elements, cultural practices, operational mechanisms, and governing vocabulary that together constituted the prototype's effective institutional form. The pattern is the prototype's most important and most durable contribution to the civilization's organizational repertoire, because the pattern is the form in which the prototype's specific achievement becomes available for replication in conditions that differ from the prototype's specific conditions, conditions in which the specific liminal district of Aldea Zamá is not available, in which the specific founding cohort of practitioners from the Tulum corridor's post-nomad recalibration is not available, in which the specific convergence of the AI displacement wave and the Caribbean geography and the first decade of the 21st century specific cultural moment is not available, but in which the pattern's organizational knowledge is available as the template for the development of a comparable institutional form adequate to the specific conditions that are available. The relationship between the prototype and the pattern is therefore not the relationship between the original and the copy, not the relationship in which the subsequent instances are valued primarily by their fidelity to the founding instance's specific form. It is the relationship between the research and the application, the relationship in which the prototype's specific achievement generates the knowledge that makes the application of that knowledge in new conditions not the copy of the prototype but the development of a new specific instance that is shaped by the pattern's organizational knowledge while being adapted to the new condition's specific requirements. The genuinely successful replication of the transition district model is not the community that most faithfully reproduces the Aldea Zamá community's specific programmatic elements in a different geography. It is the community that most effectively applies the pattern's organizational knowledge to the specific conditions of the different geography in ways that produce a comparable quality of the model's essential outcomes while departing from the prototype-specific form in every dimension. That the different conditions require different forms to address. This distinction between fidelity to the prototype and application of the pattern is operationally consequential for both the Aldea Zamá community's relationship to the subsequent instances and the subsequent instances' relationship to the Aldea Zamá community. The Aldea Zamá community's relationship to the subsequent instances is not the relationship of the original to its copies, not the relationship that requires the Aldea Zamá community to maintain a proprietary authority over what counts as a genuine transition district and to certify or deny the subsequent instances' claim to the model's designation based on their fidelity to the prototype-specific form. It is the relationship of the founding research community to the communities that apply the research's findings, the relationship that requires the Aldea Zamá community to maintain the intellectual authority to extend, refine, and honestly assess the pattern's organizational knowledge through its ongoing practice, while making the knowledge genuinely available for application in new conditions through the open-source quality of the intellectual territorial capture that Part 5 established as the governing framework's primary publication philosophy. The subsequent instance's relationship to the Aldea Zamá community is not the relationship of the copy to the original, not the relationship that requires the subsequent instances to reproduce the prototype-specific form in order to claim the model's designation. It is the relationship of the applied research to the founding research, the relationship that requires the subsequent instances to genuinely engage with the pattern's organizational knowledge, to apply it honestly to their specific conditions, to document their specific adaptations and their specific outcomes honestly, and to contribute the knowledge their specific application generates back to the pattern's ongoing development through the intellectual discourse that the open-source publication philosophy makes available. The geographical landscape in which the pattern's application will occur, the specific range of geographies whose conditions are most immediately compatible with the transition district model's deployment in the decade following the Aldea Zamá community's founding period, is worth mapping with some specificity, because the mapping reveals both the breadth of the civilizational opportunity that the pattern makes available and the specific character of the conditions that the pattern's application requires in different geographic contexts. The mapping is organized around the four primary classes of geographic condition that the pattern's application most productively addresses, each of which represents a different specific combination of the liminal architecture, the arriving practitioner population, the cultural infrastructure, and the stakeholder landscape that the transition district model requires in different relative proportions and different specific forms depending on the class of condition being addressed. The first class is the post-speculative liminal district, the class of geographic condition that most directly parallels the Aldea Zamá community's founding conditions, and that therefore offers the most immediately available opportunities for the pattern's application with the minimum adaptation from the prototype-specific form. The post-speculative liminal district is the class of built environments that have passed through a completed phase of premium development driven by a specific speculative wave, the real estate speculation of the tourism and lifestyle development market, the technology industry's office real estate speculation, the creative class's neighborhood gentrification, the wellness and alternative lifestyle market's boutique development, and that now occupy the specific liminal condition of the between time that Part 2's analysis established as the transition district model's most productive founding atmospheric condition. This class includes not only the Caribbean and Latin American tourism corridor developments that most directly parallel the Aldea Zamá community's specific geographic context, but also the European coastal town developments that the post-pandemic remote work wave partially activated and partially abandoned, the North African and Mediterranean geography's boutique development zones, whose post-speculative recalibration is producing comparable liminal conditions in comparable atmospheric registers, and the East Asian creative district developments whose post-speculative suspension is generating comparable opportunities for the transition district model's application in significantly different cultural contexts. The second class is the institutional campus transitional, the class of geographic condition represented by the educational, research, and corporate campus environments that are in the process of transitioning from their original institutional use to an undetermined alternative use as the specific institutional programs that originally justified the campus development are restructured, downsized, or eliminated by the same forces of AI displacement and post-institutional reorganization that are dissolving the professional class's institutional employment context. The institutional campus transitional offers a specific variation on the patterns application that the prototype's founding conditions do not directly parallel. The specific combination of existing high-quality spatial infrastructure, established transportation connections, and potential for diverse programmatic activation that the campus environment provides, in the specific context of the institutional authority's withdrawal that creates the liminal condition the transition district model requires as its atmospheric foundation. The institutional campus transitional specific adaptation requirements for the patterns application include the specific stakeholder conversation adjustments required for the engagement with the educational or research or corporate institution whose withdrawal from the campus is creating the liminal condition, adjustments that the governing vocabulary's second evolutionary phase framing can accommodate with the specific modifications required by the institutional stakeholders' different decision-making logic from the real estate developer's decision-making logic that the original stakeholder conversation strategy was designed to engage. The third class is the post-industrial urban district, the class of geographic condition represented by the former manufacturing and industrial districts of the major cities that have been partially activated by the creative class's initial colonization and partially abandoned by the creative class's subsequent displacement to less expensive geographies, leaving the specific combination of genuine spatial quality, atmospheric liminality, and cultural memory that makes these districts the specific urban equivalent of the Aldea Zamá community's Caribbean liminal district. The post-industrial urban district's specific adaptation requirements for the patterns application include the specific territorial commitment culture adjustments required by the urban geography's greater mobility and the greater density of competing alternatives that the urban context makes available, adjustments that the pattern's territorial rootedness characteristic requires to be addressed through the specific community formation practices that make the territorial commitment a genuine cultural norm rather than a theoretical aspiration in contexts where the nomadic option's convenience is significantly greater than in the Caribbean geography's relative isolation. The fourth class is the emerging frontier geography, the class of geographic condition represented by the new geographies that the next migration's forming wave is beginning to identify as potential destinations for the post-institutional transition's specific needs, in regions and climates and cultural contexts that the preceding waves of geographic experimentation by the mobile professional class have not yet fully colonized. The emerging frontier geography's specific adaptation requirements for the patterns application are the most demanding of the four classes, because the emerging frontier geography lacks the specific cultural infrastructure and the specific community of prior practitioners that the Aldea Zamá community's founding conditions provided as the seeding phase's primary human resources, requiring the patterns application to generate the founding cohort's comparable density and comparable commitment. From the arriving practitioner's own initiative and the governing vocabulary's specific attraction of the class of practitioners most specifically prepared by the governing framework's intellectual architecture to engage with the transition district model's founding demands in genuinely new and relatively uncultivated geographic conditions. The patterns application across these four geographic classes will produce, in the decade following the Aldea Zamá community's founding period, a global landscape of transition district instances that together constitute the specific institutional form of the post-corporate civilization's primary infrastructure for the displaced professional class's productive reintegration into the civilization's ongoing development. The landscape will not be uniform. Each instance will have the specific character of its specific geographic and cultural and historical conditions, will have adapted the pattern's organizational knowledge to those conditions in the specific ways that the conditions require, and will have contributed the specific knowledge its specific adaptation has generated to the pattern's ongoing development through the intellectual discourse that the open-source publication philosophy makes available. The landscape will be recognizably coherent. Each instance will share the specific essential organizational characteristics that the pattern's core establishes as the model's non-negotiable requirements. The governing vocabulary's intellectual framework, the weekly metabolism's operational structure, the architecture of arrival's integration design, the myth infrastructure's civilizational imagination, the stakeholder conversation's social proof discipline, and the guild model's recursive stability. And the landscape will be culturally connected. Each instance's community of practitioners will be in the specific intellectual and cultural relationship to the Aldea Zamá community's founding instance and to each other that the open-source publication philosophy and the multilingual publishing ecosystem together make possible. The relationship of the applied research communities to the founding research community and to each other that makes the pattern's ongoing development a genuinely collaborative civilizational project rather than the competitive fragmentation of a new institutional category into incompatible proprietary variants. The specific mechanism through which the pattern is transmitted from the prototype to the subsequent instances is the intellectual territorial capture's ongoing publication. The continuous extension of the governing vocabulary's intellectual framework into the specific dimensions and the specific domains and the specific geographic and cultural contexts that the pattern's application in new conditions requires to be addressed. The handbook is the pattern's founding publication, the comprehensive establishment of the governing vocabulary's intellectual framework and the operational specifications that together constitute the pattern's primary content. The subsequent publications, the Tuesday sessions practitioner accounts, the Thursday dinners honest testimonies, the Monday briefings collective intelligence about the accelerating landscape, the super-Earth universe's mythological development, the social proof infrastructure's documented evidence, are the pattern's ongoing extension, adding the specific operational knowledge that the prototype's practice generates across its development to the pattern's total body of organizational knowledge and making that knowledge available to the subsequent instances through the publication channels that the intellectual territorial capture's open-source philosophy provides. The pattern's transmission is therefore not a top-down institutional process, not the certification program or the licensing arrangement or the franchise agreement that the proprietary model of intellectual territorial capture would employ as the primary transmission mechanism. It is the bottom-up intellectual process of the open-source community's ongoing collaborative development, the process in which the pattern's organizational knowledge is continuously refined through the honest collective engagement of all the instances that are applying it, each contributing the specific knowledge their specific application generates to the total body of the pattern's organizational knowledge, and each benefiting from the total body's continuous refinement through the contributions of all the other instances. The Aldea Zamá community's specific role in this process is the role of the founding research community, the role of maintaining the most comprehensive and the most honestly engaged relationship to the pattern's essential organizational knowledge, of generating the ongoing publications that extend the pattern's intellectual framework most comprehensively, and of maintaining the specific quality of the intellectual authority that the definitional primacy provides as the primary instrument for ensuring that the pattern's ongoing development is organized around the genuine organizational knowledge that the prototype's honest practice generates rather than the aspirational approximations that the aspirational culture's adoption of the model's vocabulary would otherwise make available as the easier substitute. The pattern's relationship to the civilization it serves is the relationship between the organizational form and the civilizational function, the relationship between the specific institutional structure of the transition district model and the specific civilizational challenge of providing the displaced professional class with the infrastructure required to convert their institutional displacement from the catastrophic loss of identity and capability that the unsupported transition consistently produces into the generative contribution of redeployed operational knowledge and genuine sovereign practice that the post-institutional civilization urgently requires as the human foundation of its own continued development. The pattern's civilizational significance is the significance of the organizational form that is adequate to this civilizational function, the significance of the institutional infrastructure that converts the civilizational disruption's human cost from the permanent depletion of the civilization's most capable human resources into the temporary reorientation of those resources toward the sovereign practice and the community formation and the mythological development and the intellectual production that the post-institutional civilization needs its most capable practitioners to be engaged in. The pattern is the organizational form of the civilizational response. The prototype is the pattern's founding instantiation. And the civilization's long-term trajectory, the specific direction in which the human community that is navigating the AI displacement wave and the post-institutional identity dissolution develops over the coming decades, is significantly determined by whether the pattern is successfully transmitted from the prototype to the sufficient number of subsequent instances to constitute a genuinely global infrastructure for the civilizational response or remains a local and isolated achievement, whose significance is primarily historical rather than operationally consequential for the civilization's ongoing development. The significance of the pattern's transmission is therefore not merely the significance of the Aldea Zamá community's contribution to the global landscape of post-corporate transition infrastructure. It is the significance of the civilization's specific response to the specific challenge of the post-institutional transition and the adequacy of that response to the challenge's actual scale. The challenge's actual scale, the number of high-agency, high-capability practitioners being displaced from the institutional context at the accelerating pace that the AI development wave's continued advancement is producing, is a scale that the Aldea Zamá community's single founding instance, however excellently executed, cannot adequately address on its own. The adequate address of the challenge at the civilization's actual scale requires the pattern's transmission to sufficient subsequent instances to constitute the global infrastructure for the response that the challenge requires. The Aldea Zamá community's specific contribution to the pattern's transmission is the prototype's founding instance and the governing vocabulary's intellectual framework. Contributions that are necessary conditions for the pattern's transmission but not sufficient conditions for the transmission's completion at the scale the civilization's challenge requires. The sufficient conditions for the pattern's transmission at the civilization's actual scale include the specific quality of the prototype's operational demonstration, the specific quality of the governing vocabulary's intellectual framework, the specific quality of the social proof infrastructure's documented evidence, and the specific quality of the open-source publication philosophy's transmission mechanism, all of which are conditions that the Aldea Zamá community's second-phase strategy is specifically designed to produce and that the preceding parts of this handbook have specified in the operational detail that the production's genuine achievement requires. If the Aldea Zamá community produces these conditions with the specific quality of genuineness that the governing framework demands, if the Monday briefings are genuinely cognitively synchronizing, the Tuesday sessions are genuinely producing, the Wednesday nights are genuinely mythologizing, the Thursday dinners are genuinely transferring, the Friday stress tests are genuinely honest, the Saturday atmosphere nights are genuinely activating, and the Sunday integrations are genuinely integrating, then the pattern's transmission to sufficient subsequent instances to constitute the global infrastructure will follow not as the consequence of any specific transmission strategy, but as the natural consequence of the pattern's genuine quality attracting the specific class of practitioners and the specific class of geographic conditions that the pattern's application in new contexts requires and that the genuine quality's global reputation generates through the specific mechanisms of the recognition cycle's positive feedback. The civilization is not waiting for the transition district to be built. The civilization is being displaced at the accelerating pace of the AI development wave's continued advancement, and the displaced practitioners are navigating the transition with whatever resources the existing inadequate infrastructure of retreats and co-working spaces and digital nomad communities and inspirational newsletters provides. Resources that the governing framework has established in the preceding parts of this handbook are genuinely inadequate to the genuine challenge that the genuine transition requires to be genuinely supported. The civilization needs the pattern now. The prototype is being built now. The governing vocabulary is published now. The intellectual territorial capture is accomplished now. The pattern's transmission to the subsequent instances can begin now, not after the prototype has been fully demonstrated, not after the global recognition has been formally achieved, not after the recursive stability's 4 cycles have completed sufficient iterations to demonstrate the positive feedback's genuine productive quality. The pattern's transmission begins the moment the governing vocabulary is published and the subsequent communities that are attempting to address the same civilizational challenge in different geographic conditions encounter the vocabulary and recognize in it the specific articulation of what they have been attempting to build without the conceptual infrastructure that the vocabulary provides. The publication is the transmission's beginning. This handbook is the transmission's beginning. The civilization's response to its most urgent current challenge begins here, in this specific handbook, in this specific vocabulary, in this specific moment of the intellectual territorial capture that makes the pattern available for the civilization's application in every subsequent geography where the liminal district and the arriving practitioners and the founding cohort and the governing mythology and the experimental accommodation model and the guild model's recursive stability can be assembled into the specific institutional form that the civilization needs and that the pattern provides the organizational knowledge to build. The prototype and the pattern, the first and the template, the founding instance and the transmission mechanism. the Aldea Zamá community and the global civilization of post-corporate transition districts that the Aldea Zamá community's genuine practice and genuine publication makes possible. The relationship between these two is the relationship this chapter has been establishing in the operational precision that the civilizational argument requires. The prototype is being built. The pattern is being published. The transmission is beginning. The civilization is the destination. And the destination is not as far as the civilizational scale of the challenge might suggest. It is precisely as close as the genuine practice of the genuine community in the genuine territory at the genuine historical moment that the genuine governing framework has established as the specific starting point from which the civilization's adequate response to its most consequential current challenge can genuinely begin. Part 8. The Civilizational Argument, Chapter 40. 10 years from now. The speculative account of a future state is always vulnerable to the specific criticism that it is indistinguishable from wishful thinking, that the imagination of a desired future 10 years hence is an exercise in aspiration rather than analysis, and that the aspiration's presentation in the form of a descriptive account of a future condition, rather than a normative account of a desired condition, is a rhetorical sleight of hand designed to make the aspiration seem more probable than the honest assessment of the evidence warrants. This criticism deserves to be acknowledged before the speculative account is offered, and acknowledged honestly rather than defensively, because the acknowledgement is what distinguishes the operationally grounded speculative account from the aspirational fiction that the criticism is correctly applied to. The operationally grounded speculative account does not claim predictive accuracy. It does not claim that the future it describes will occur as described, or that the specific details of the description are more likely than the innumerable alternative future states that the same starting conditions could produce through the specific contingencies of human decision-making and external circumstance change that no governing framework can fully anticipate. What it claims is something more modest and more operationally useful than predictive accuracy. The claim that the future it describes is the specific shape of what the genuine practice of the genuine community in the genuine territory with the genuine governing framework makes possible over a sufficient duration of genuine practice. The specific shape of the second phase strategy's genuine achievement if the conditions this handbook has established as necessary and sufficient for the achievement are genuinely produced and genuinely maintained across the 10 years the speculative account is describing. The 10-year timeline is chosen for the specific reason that the transition district's governing framework identifies the recursive stability's 4 cycles positive feedback as requiring approximately this duration to complete sufficient iterations to demonstrate the specific quality of the self-sustaining organizational vitality that distinguishes the genuinely recursively stable community from the community, whose initial conditions are productive enough to generate impressive early results. Without the organizational depth required to sustain those results across the generational membership transitions that 10 years of genuine operation reliably produces. 10 years is not an arbitrary duration. It is the specific minimum duration that the knowledge accumulation and transmission cycle, the publication and recognition cycle, the atmospheric activation and stakeholder accommodation cycle, and the myth production and identity coherence cycle each require to complete sufficient iterations of their positive feedback to demonstrate the specific quality of the productive amplification that distinguishes genuine recursive stability from the temporary positive feedback of the founding period's exceptional initial conditions. The physical condition of the district in 10 years is the most immediately visible dimension of the speculative account and the dimension most directly enabled by the atmospheric activation and stakeholder accommodation cycle's positive feedback across the decade's development. The specific spatial transformation that 10 years of genuine practice of the experimental accommodation model and the social proof infrastructure's honest documentation produces in the Aldea Zamá district is not a wholesale architectural renovation. It is the specific, organic, incrementally accumulated transformation of the district's physical identity through the progressive conversion of the liminal conditions suspended spaces into the specifically activated spaces of a genuinely inhabited and genuinely productive cultural community. The storefronts that were dark at the founding period's beginning have been progressively activated through the experimental accommodation model's successive arrangements. First, the pilot activation nodes whose temporary activation leases generated the social proof that enabled the subsequent arrangement's expansion. Then the rotating cultural occupation's more frequent presence in the hospitality spaces. Then the dedicated programmatic spaces of the second phase program's full development period. whose conventional leasing arrangements the expanded social proof infrastructure eventually made possible, and whose physical installation transformed the specific commercial units from the generic premium retail spaces of the first phase's commercial logic into the specifically designed spaces of the transition district's specific programmatic requirements. The pedestrian corridors that were sparsely populated at the founding period's beginning have acquired the specific quality of genuine daily foot traffic that the community's programmatic life generates, not the tourist foot traffic of the lifestyle destination's peak season, which was the first phase's commercial logic's primary target and which produces the specific quality of transient, consumption-oriented, aesthetically engaged but operationally uncommitted human presence that the transition district model identifies as insufficient for genuine community formation, but the practitioner foot traffic of the community's daily programmatic engagement, which produces the specific quality of purposeful, relationally embedded, operationally committed human presence that the genuine community's daily life requires. The plazas that were eerily quiet at the founding period's beginning have acquired the specific quality of genuinely inhabited social space that the Thursday dinners and the Saturday atmosphere nights and the Sunday integrations have gradually built through the accumulation of the community's specific shared experiences in those specific spaces, the quality that makes the plaza not merely a well-designed outdoor commercial environment, but a specific place that the community has made its own, through the specific memories and the specific relationships and the specific cultural productions that the plaza has hosted across the decade's development. The residential character of the district has been transformed by the cultural residency partnerships, progressive development, the specific accumulation of the community's long-term residential practitioners whose sovereign practices have developed in the district over the decade to the point where the district itself has become the specific territorial foundation of the practitioner's sovereign life, rather than the transitional geography of a transition in process. The initiated practitioner who arrived at the district 5 years ago as an uninitiated arrival navigating the first stages of the staged cognitive acclimatization framework, whose conversion arc the community's knowledge transmission function supported through the full progression from arriving consumer to sovereign contributor, and whose sovereign practice has developed in the district's specific territorial and community conditions to the point where the practice is specifically adapted to and specifically dependent on the district's specific cultural and physical environment, is the specific residential practitioner type that the Cultural Residency Partnership's decade of development has produced and that now constitutes the significant proportion of the district's long-term residential population, whose presence gives the district the specific quality of genuine permanent inhabitation that the first phase's predominantly transient population was never sufficient to produce. The community's composition in 10 years reflects the specific dynamics of the conversion arc's recursive operation across multiple generational cycles of the community's operation. The founding cohort's members, the initiated practitioners whose specific convergence in the district at the specific historical moment of the founding period made the community's establishment possible, are present in the community in the specific variety of roles that the decade's operation has produced through the specific differentiation of the founding cohort's members' sovereign practices across the decade's development. Some founding cohort members remain in the district as long-term residents whose sovereign practices have developed into the specific forms that the district's territorial conditions most specifically support, the sovereign publishers whose publishing practices have developed the specific audiences and the specific publication ecosystems that the district's cultural identity and the governing vocabulary's intellectual framework together attract, the initiated practitioners whose knowledge transmission functions have developed into the specific forms that the community's current developmental stage most specifically requires, and the governing practitioners whose cultural governance responsibilities have developed into the specific forms that the community's current organizational maturity most specifically enables. Other founding cohort members have departed the district to apply the pattern's organizational knowledge in the subsequent instances that the decade's development has established in other geographies, present in the global community of transition district practitioners whose intellectual and cultural relationship to the Aldea Zamá community's founding instance, the open-source publication philosophy, and the multilingual publishing ecosystem together maintain across the geographic distances that the sovereign practice's diverse territorial requirements have produced. The community's current membership in 10 years is predominantly composed of the practitioners who arrived after the founding period's initial establishment, who arrived not as the adventurous founders of an unprecedented institutional form, but as the pragmatic participants in a demonstrated organizational model, whose genuine achievement the social proof infrastructure's accumulated documentation had made specifically available for their assessment before they committed their arrival. These practitioners are different from the founding cohort not in the essential character of their engagement with the community's governing framework. The commitment to operational honesty, the genuine territorial investment, the honest accounts failure-inclusive character, the embodied demonstrations daily discipline, the creative inheritance's ongoing participation, but in the specific quality of their relationship to the community's own history, which they have not participated in. Creating but have inherited as the specific cultural inheritance that the continuity multiplier's honest account and embodied demonstration and creative inheritance have made available to them as the genuine organizational resource that the recursive stability's knowledge accumulation and transmission cycle was specifically designed to produce and transmit. The community's knowledge base in 10 years reflects the decades accumulated operation of the knowledge accumulation and transmission cycle's positive feedback. The specific depth and the specific honesty of the operational knowledge about the post-institutional transition in the specific conditions of the specific geography and the specific historical moment that 10 years of genuine practice has generated, and the Thursday dinner's honest accounts and the Friday stress tests operational assessments and the Tuesday publishing sessions production reviews have collectively accumulated into the community's aggregate knowledge base. The depth of this knowledge base is not primarily a function of the quantity of the practitioners who have contributed to it. Quantity without quality is the specific failure mode that the credential inflation failure mode produces, and the community's cultural architecture's quality governance standards have been maintained across the decades' development against the specific pressures of democratic inclusivity and growth imperative that consistently work against the quality governances. Honest standards. The depth is a function of the specific quality of the honest engagement with the operational reality of the post-institutional transition that the community's culture of operational honesty has maintained as the primary standard of the knowledge base's development. The quality of the accounts that have been genuinely honest about the failure modes, genuinely specific about the unexpected gifts, and genuinely operational in the granular detail that distinguishes the practitioner's hard-won knowledge from the aspirational account that the motivational culture has produced in such abundance as the substitute for the specific honest knowledge that the transition district's community has been specifically designed to generate and transmit. The global publication record in 10 years reflects the decades accumulated operation of the publication and recognition cycle's positive feedback. The specific quality and the specific global reach of the community's sovereign publishing ecosystem's outputs that 10 years of the Tuesday sessions output-first production culture, and the multilingual publishing infrastructure's development and the NFP production ecosystem's consistent physical publication have generated. The publication record's total volume is significant. 10 years of weekly Tuesday sessions production, augmented by the community's governing practitioners and contributing practitioners' ongoing publication activity outside the Tuesday sessions specific format, and extended by the multilingual translations and the NFP editions and the Super Earth Universe's narrative publications that the Wednesday sessions myth engine has produced across the decade's development, constitutes a genuinely substantial body of published intellectual and creative work. But the publication record's most important quality is not its volume. It is the specific consistency of the honest, operationally grounded, mythologically rich engagement with the post-corporate transition's genuine complexity that the community's publication culture has maintained across the decade's development through the specific mechanisms of the publication review's honest collective assessment and the quality governance standards' consistent application. The global reputation in 10 years is the specific consequence of the publication record's quality and the social proof infrastructure's documented evidence combining, through the recognition cycle's positive feedback, to produce the specific quality of the definitionally primary instance's global recognition that Chapter 38 established as the strategic destination of the second phase strategy's full development. The globally recognized designation has been earned through the specific mechanisms that Chapter 38 specified, through the intellectual territorial capture of the governing vocabulary's comprehensive first publication, through the operational demonstration of the model's genuine practice, and through the social proof infrastructure's accumulated documentation of the model's genuine cultural and human value. The global recognition is not the self-declared designation of the community's aspirational self-presentation. It is the specific quality of the external validation that the global audiences whose recognition is most meaningful as evidence of the model's genuine intellectual and cultural authority have provided through their specific engagement with the community's publications, their specific citation of the community's governing vocabulary in their own intellectual productions, and their specific identification of the Aldea Zamá community as the definitionally primary instance of the post-corporate transition district category in the global discourse about the institutional forms adequate to the civilization's response to the AI displacement waves challenge. The pattern's replication landscape in 10 years reflects the specific progress of the pattern's transmission from the prototype to the subsequent instances that the decade's operation of the open-source publication philosophy and the multilingual publishing ecosystem and the recognition cycle's global reputation generation have together produced. The global landscape of transition district instances is not yet the comprehensive civilizational infrastructure that the challenge's full scale requires. The 10-year timeline is not sufficient for the pattern's transmission to reach the full geographic range and the full institutional diversity that the civilization's adequate response requires across its multiple geographies and its multiple classes of liminal architectural condition. But the landscape in 10 years has the specific quality of a demonstrated pattern rather than a singular prototype, the quality of a model that has been applied in sufficient subsequent instances, in sufficient geographic and cultural diversity, and with sufficient operational honesty about what the applications have produced and what they have not produced, to demonstrate that the transition district model is a genuinely replicable pattern rather than a historically contingent artifact of the specific conditions of the Aldea Zamá founding instance. The subsequent instances, perhaps 3 to 5 genuinely operational communities in different geographies and different cultural contexts, each having adapted the pattern's organizational knowledge to their specific conditions with the specific quality of honest engagement that the governing framework requires, and each having contributed the specific knowledge their specific adaptation has generated to the pattern's ongoing development through the intellectual discourse that the open source publication philosophy makes available, constitute the specific body of evidence that demonstrates the pattern's replicability and that enables the pattern's transmission to accelerate in the decade following the first decade's demonstration period. The relationship between the Aldea Zamá community and the subsequent instances in 10 years is the relationship that the prototype-to-pattern framework established as the appropriate relationship, the relationship of the founding research community to the communities that apply the research's findings, characterized by the intellectual authority of genuine priority and genuine quality rather than the institutional authority of proprietary control. The Aldea Zamá community maintains its intellectual authority through the continuous publication of the governing vocabulary's extensions and the continuous demonstration of the model's operational validity that the community's ongoing genuine practice generates. The specific quality of the ongoing intellectual engagement with the model's essential character that distinguishes the founding research community from the community that has ceased to develop and whose intellectual authority therefore rests on the prior achievement of the founding period rather than the ongoing achievement of the continued genuine practice. The subsequent instances maintain their relationship to the Aldea Zamá community through the specific quality of their honest engagement with the pattern's organizational knowledge and their honest contribution of their specific adaptations knowledge to the pattern's ongoing development. The specific quality of the intellectual discourse that the open-source publication philosophy makes available and that the multilingual publishing ecosystem makes globally accessible across the geographic and cultural distances that separate the subsequent instances from the founding instance. The community's relationship to the broader civilization in 10 years is the relationship of the genuinely operational institutional form to the civilization's ongoing challenge. The specific quality of the transition district's contribution to the civilization's adequate response to the AI displacement waves challenge that 10 years of genuine practice has made demonstrably real rather than theoretically proposed. The practitioners whose post-institutional transitions the Aldea Zamá community has supported across the decade, the specific individuals whose conversion arcs the community's architecture of arrival has guided from arriving disorientation to sovereign contribution, whose dream validation processes the Dreamcatcher protocol has organized, whose sovereign practices the weekly metabolism's operational honesty has helped to build and to honest assess and to modify toward genuine viability, are the specific human evidence of the transition district's civilizational contribution, not the institutions they have built, however genuinely excellent those institutions may be, not the publications they have produced, however genuinely valuable those publications may be, not the mythological contributions they have made, however genuinely enriching those contributions may be. The specific human beings whose sovereign lives have been genuinely enabled by the community's genuine support of their genuine transitions are the specific evidence that the transition district's civilizational contribution is not merely the intellectual achievement of the governing vocabulary's publication or the organizational achievement of the recursive stability's demonstration, but the human achievement of the specific lives genuinely lived in the specific sovereign practice that the transition district's community made genuinely possible. These specific human beings are the civilization's response to its own disruption, in the most literal and most consequential form available. They are the displaced professionals who, having received the specific support that the community's genuine practice provided, have developed the specific sovereign practices that the post-institutional civilization needs to sustain itself through the continued advancement of the AI displacement wave's restructuring of the professional world's institutional architecture. They are the sovereign publishers whose publications extend the intellectual territory of the civilizational discourse about the post-corporate transition into the specific domains and the specific geographic and cultural contexts that the founding instances publications cannot reach alone. They are the initiated practitioners whose continuity multiplier functions are maintaining the cultural standards of the communities they are embedded in against the specific social pressures that consistently work against those standards. They are the patterns carriers, the specific human beings whose genuine engagement with the community's governing framework has made the pattern's organizational knowledge genuinely available to them as the specific intellectual and operational resource that makes their own subsequent contributions to the civilization's institutional development possible. The civilization in 10 years has not resolved the challenge of the AI displacement wave. The wave's advancement is not linear and its trajectory is not predictable with the precision that a 10-year timeline speculative account would require to claim genuine predictive accuracy. But the civilization in 10 years has something it does not have now: the specific institutional form of the post-corporate transition district, demonstrated through the Aldea Zamá community's founding instance and the subsequent instance's honest replication, available as the specific organizational template for the adequate response to the challenge in the specific geographic and cultural contexts where the challenge is most acutely felt. The institutional form's availability does not guarantee its deployment at the adequate scale. The civilization's capacity to deploy the pattern at the scale the challenge requires is dependent on the specific decisions of the specific practitioners and the specific stakeholders and the specific investors and the specific communities that the pattern's demonstrated availability makes available for consideration. But the pattern's availability is the necessary condition for the deployment's possibility, the condition without which the adequate response is not merely uncertain but organizationally impossible, because the adequate response requires the specific organizational knowledge that the pattern encodes and that the prototype's genuine practice and honest publication has made available for the civilization's use. The speculative account of 10 years from now is therefore not a prediction of the future. It is a description of the specific future that the genuine practice of the genuine community in the genuine territory with the genuine governing framework makes available for the civilization's realization through the specific decisions that the specific practitioners and stakeholders and investors and communities will make in the decade the speculative account describes. The future is not guaranteed. The description is not a forecast. But the description is honest in the specific sense that the governing framework demands honesty in every dimension of the community's cultural production. It describes the specific shape of what is genuinely achievable through the genuine practice of the specific governing framework this handbook has established, without inflating the description with the aspirational additions that the motivational culture's vision of the future consistently introduces, and without deflating the description with the skeptical subtractions that the cynical culture's assessment of ambitious institutional projects consistently applies. The genuinely achievable future of the transition district's 10-year development is the future described in this chapter. Not more, not less, not guaranteed, but genuinely possible, genuinely worth working toward, and genuinely available as the destination of the journey that the handbook's governing framework has established as the specific direction of the genuine practice that the Aldea Zamá community is beginning now. 10 years from now, the district will be inhabited. The community will be genuine. The knowledge will be deep. The mythology will be rich. The practitioners will be sovereign. The pattern will be available. The civilization will be better equipped to respond to its most urgent current challenge than it is today. And the specific human beings who built the prototype, who recognized the window and moved through it, who practiced the weekly metabolism's 7 disciplines with the specific quality of honest engagement that the governing framework demands, who maintained the cultural architecture's quality governance against the specific social pressures that consistently work against it, who published the governing vocabulary's honest extensions and the social proof infrastructure's honest documentation. And the super-Earth universe's honest mythological development across the full decades sustained genuine practice, will have produced something that the civilization needed and that the governing framework made possible and that the genuine human beings who committed to the genuine practice made real. That is the 10-year account. That is the speculative destination toward which the genuine practice is genuinely directed. And the genuine practice begins where every genuine practice begins, in the specific present moment of the specific practitioners who are reading this and who are, in reading it, beginning the specific journey that the speculative destination requires. Part 8. The Civilizational Argument Chapter 41. The first move is the manifesto. Every territorial contest, and the contest for the intellectual territory of the post-corporate transition district is a genuine territorial contest, conducted between the governing framework this handbook has established and every subsequent framework that will attempt to define the same domain in different terms for different institutional interests, is determined primarily by the first move. Not because the first move is the only move, or because the subsequent moves cannot recover the territory that a weak first move has conceded, or because the first move's advantages are insurmountable by the superior quality of a later move's execution. The first move's determining significance is more specific and more structural than the general competitive principle of first mover advantage implies. The first move's significance in the intellectual territorial contest is the significance of the frame, the specific conceptual architecture within which every subsequent engagement with the territory must conduct itself, whether in the form of the citation that acknowledges the frame's prior establishment, the extension that builds on the frame's conceptual foundation, or the contestation that must engage the frame's specific terms in order to argue against them. The first move establishes the frame. Every subsequent move operates within the frame the first move established. And the entity that established the frame has a specific and durable form of territorial authority over the domain's intellectual development that is not the authority of the superior argument. Subsequent arguments can be superior in specific respects, but the authority of the prior and comprehensive engagement with the domain's essential character that makes every subsequent engagement in some sense a response to the first move rather than an independent initiative. This is why the manifesto is not merely the appropriate form for the first move but the specifically optimal form, the specific literary and intellectual genre whose organizational logic is most precisely aligned with the requirements of the intellectual territorial contest's first move. The manifesto is the genre of the comprehensive prior engagement, the genre that does not merely argue for a position but establishes the vocabulary, the conceptual architecture, the operational framework, and the mythological infrastructure within which the position is argued, in a form that is simultaneously the argument and the territory's intellectual constitution. The well-executed manifesto does not merely say what it believes, it establishes the specific language in which what is believed can be most fully and most precisely expressed, and in doing so it establishes the specific language in which every subsequent engagement with the same domain must conduct itself if it wishes to be legible to the intellectual community that the manifesto's language has formed. The poorly executed manifesto argues without constituting. It makes its case in the language it finds available rather than in the language it forges, and therefore cedes the territorial authority that the intellectual constitution provides to whatever subsequent engagement has the patience and the comprehensive engagement to forge the language that the domain's full treatment requires. This handbook is a manifesto in the precise sense the genre requires, not a manifesto in the popular sense of the impassioned declaration of belief that any motivated person can produce, but a manifesto in the structural sense of the comprehensive prior engagement with a domain's essential character that establishes the vocabulary, the operational framework, and the mythological infrastructure through which the domain will subsequently be understood by every serious engagement that follows. The evidence of this is not the handbook's ambition. Any amount of ambition can be claimed in any document's introduction without the subsequent chapter's comprehensive development of the claimed ambition being achieved. The evidence is the specific organizational achievement of the 8 parts and the 41 chapters and the 6 appendices that have preceded this concluding chapter, the specific intellectual work of establishing the vocabulary through the governing framework's terminological precision, the operational framework through the weekly metabolism's programmatic specifications, and the architecture of arrival's integration design and the stakeholder conversations sequence strategy, and the Mythological infrastructure through the Myth Infrastructure's 4 chapters and the Super-Earth Universe's founding documents and the NFP's physical myth-object concept and the publishing as territorial capture doctrine. The manifesto's claim to comprehensive prior engagement with the domain's essential character is established not by the ambition of the claim but by the completeness of the engagement that the claim requires and that this handbook's 41 chapters demonstrate. The first move's relationship to everything that follows it in the transition district's development is the relationship between the intellectual constitution and the community's subsequent institutional development. The relationship in which the Constitution provides the foundational framework that the institutions and the practices and the cultural productions and the social relationships of the community's life operate within, without those subsequent developments requiring the Constitution's repeated reestablishment as the precondition of their operation. The Constitution is established once in the first move. Every subsequent development of the community's life draws on the Constitution's intellectual authority without needing to reestablish it. Draws on it in the specific way that the practitioner who has internalized the governing vocabulary's conceptual architecture draws on that architecture in every specific application of the governing framework's operational principles without needing to rederive the principles from first principles with each new application. The first move's intellectual constitution is the community's most durable asset. More durable than any specific practitioner's contribution, more durable than any specific period's programmatic excellence, more durable than any specific stakeholder relationship's productive accommodation, because the intellectual constitution's authority is constituted through the prior and comprehensive engagement with the domain's essential character rather than through the specific excellence of any subsequent period's practice, and the prior and comprehensive engagement is a historical fact that no subsequent development can undo. The manifesto's relationship to the community that implements it is the relationship that this chapter is most specifically concerned with establishing, because it is the relationship most directly relevant to the practitioners who are reading this handbook and who are, in reading it, in the specific position of the person who must decide what to do with the intellectual territory that the manifesto has established. The manifesto is not the community. The manifesto is the community's intellectual constitution, the specific prior engagement with the domain's essential character that establishes the vocabulary and the operational framework and the mythological infrastructure within which the community's life will be conducted. The community is what happens when the practitioners who have internalized the manifesto's intellectual constitution begin to act on the basis of that constitution in the specific physical territory that the transition district's governing framework has identified as the appropriate site for the community's founding instance. The manifesto provides the constitution. The community provides the life. The life without the Constitution is the community that has the energy and the commitment and the genuine aspiration, but not the specific intellectual architecture that gives the energy and commitment and aspiration their specific operational form and their specific cultural authority. The Constitution without the life is the manifesto that has the specific intellectual architecture, but not the practitioners who embody it in the specific daily practice that gives the architecture its operational reality and its evidentiary authority. The transition district requires both, requires the manifesto and the community in the specific relationship in which the manifesto's intellectual constitution provides the community's life its specific governing framework, and the community's life provides the manifesto's intellectual constitution its specific operational embodiment and its specific cultural authority. The specific implication of the first move being the manifesto for the practitioners who are reading this handbook is the implication that the most consequential action available to the practitioner who has genuinely engaged with the governing framework's intellectual architecture is not the action of building the community. The community will be built through the sustained accumulation of the specific actions that the governing framework specifies in the preceding chapter's operational detail, and the building will take the time it requires to be genuine rather than the time a more impatient approach would prefer. The most consequential action available is the action of beginning, the specific act of starting the practice of the first element of the weekly metabolism in the first available space with the first available practitioner, not because the first available space is the optimal space or the first available practitioner is the optimal founding cohort, but because the beginning is the first move's operational expression and the first move's operational expression is the specific condition that makes every subsequent development of the community's life possible rather than perpetually deferred by the waiting for the optimal conditions that the impatience for the optimal suppresses the beginning that the available conditions make immediately achievable. The beginning is the practice. The practice is the community's generation of the cultural reality that makes the community real rather than aspirational. The cultural reality is what the social proof infrastructure documents. The documentation is what the stakeholder conversation deploys as its primary instrument. The stakeholder conversation is what produces the experimental accommodation model's first agreements. The first agreements are what provide the community's cultural production with the specific spatial resources that make the cultural production's quality and the cultural production's atmospheric impact more ambitious and more visible than the informal conditions of the seeding phase make possible. The more ambitious and more visible cultural production is what generates the global reputation's first external validations. The first external validations are what initiate the recognition cycle's positive feedback. The positive feedback is what produces the global recognition's achieved condition. And the globally recognized condition is what establishes the transition district as the definitionally primary instance of the model whose pattern is available for the civilization's application in every subsequent geographic context where the challenge requires the pattern's deployment. This sequence, from the beginning to the recognition to the civilization, is not a guaranteed sequence. It is the sequence that the genuine practice of the genuine governing framework makes genuinely possible, subject to the specific contingencies of human decision-making and external circumstance change that no governing framework can fully anticipate. But the sequence's possibility is established by the manifesto's prior engagement with the domain's essential character, and the possibility is not available, is specifically and structurally unavailable, to the community that has not established the intellectual constitution that the manifesto provides as the first move's specific contribution to the territorial contest. The community that begins without the intellectual constitution begins in the specific position of the practitioner who attempts the post-institutional transition without the dream validation framework, capable of achieving impressive beginnings but structurally vulnerable to the specific failure modes that the framework's absence leaves unaddressed, because the framework's intellectual architecture is the specific instrument that addresses those failure modes and that makes the transitions. Completion achievable by practitioners of genuine but not exceptional capability. The manifesto is the dream validation framework for the transition district itself, the specific intellectual architecture that addresses the community building project's specific failure modes and makes the community's genuine achievement possible by practitioners who are committed and capable and honest, but who are not the exceptional founders whose exceptional individual characteristics are the conventional community's primary organizational resource. The first move is the manifesto. The manifesto has been made. This handbook is the manifesto. Its publication before the community has been fully established, before the experimental accommodation model's first agreements have been secured, before the founding cohort has reached the density that the seeding phase's completion requires, before the weekly metabolism's first complete cycle has been conducted, before the social proof infrastructure's first layer has been fully developed, is not the premature publication of a claim that the evidence has not yet earned. It is the strategically necessary publication of the intellectual constitution that the community requires as the foundation of its genuine beginning. The publication before the building is the manifesto's specific form of intellectual territorial capture, the specific act of establishing the governing vocabulary's conceptual authority before any competing vocabulary can claim the domain's intellectual territory by the prior establishment of a different governing framework. The publication after the building is the documentation of what has been achieved, which is the retrospective record's function rather than the intellectual constitution's function. The intellectual constitution must precede the building it governs, because the building that precedes the constitution is the building that is governed by the ambient assumptions of the domain's existing discourse rather than by the specific intellectual architecture that the governing framework has developed through the comprehensive prior engagement with the domain's essential character that the manifesto's 41 chapters represent. The manifesto's address, the specific practitioners and stakeholders and communities and geographies that this handbook has been written for and toward, is not a single audience but the specific range of audiences that the governing framework's different dimensions most directly serve. The practitioners whose post-institutional transitions the transition district model is most specifically designed to support are the handbook's primary audience. The specific displaced professionals and creative practitioners and researchers and technologists whose institutional displacement has produced the specific condition of identity without architecture that Part 1's 6 chapters have diagnosed with the specific operational precision that the diagnosis requires to be genuinely useful, rather than merely accurate. The property stakeholders whose experimental accommodation model's adoption, the stakeholder conversation strategy, is designed to produce are the handbook's secondary audience. The specific developers and landlords and plaza administrators and master plan managers whose cooperation the second phase strategy requires, and whose specific decision-making logic Part 6-5 chapters have analyzed with the specific operational precision that the analysis requires to produce the governing vocabulary's effective deployment. The subsequent instance communities whose pattern application the prototype-to-pattern framework anticipates across the decade's global landscape of comparable liminal conditions and comparable arriving populations are the handbook's tertiary audience. The specific practitioners in the comparable geographies whose encounter with the governing vocabulary's comprehensive intellectual framework provides the specific conceptual infrastructure their own pattern application requires to be the application of the pattern's organizational knowledge rather than the independent reinvention of the same institutional form without the benefit of the founding instance's accumulated operational experience. The manifesto's claim, the specific intellectual territorial claim that this handbook's 41 chapters have been establishing and that this concluding chapter is now making explicit as the claim of the first move, is the claim of the comprehensive prior engagement with the post-corporate transition district's essential character. The claim is not modest. The modesty would be the dishonesty that the governing framework's commitment to operational honesty requires to be rejected in every dimension of the community's cultural production, including the dimension of the manifesto's own self-description. The claim is comprehensive and it is precise and it is the first of its kind in the specific sense that the intellectual territorial capture requires. The first publication that engages the post-corporate transition district model with the specific combination of conceptual breadth, operational detail, mythological depth, and honest cultural self-assessment that the domain's essential character requires for the comprehensive prior engagement that the territorial claim demands. The claim will be contested. The contestations will be welcome. The intellectual discourse that the contestation initiates is the specific form of the governing vocabulary's extension and refinement that the open-source publication philosophy anticipates and encourages as the mechanism of the pattern's ongoing development. The contestations that engage the governing vocabulary's specific terms and the operational framework's specific mechanisms and the mythological infrastructure's specific productions in the course of arguing against specific elements of the framework's analysis are the specific form of the intellectual discourse that demonstrates the governing vocabulary's territorial authority rather than undermining it. Because the discourse that engages the governing vocabulary's terms in the process of contesting specific elements of the framework is the discourse that the governing vocabulary has provided the conceptual architecture for, and the provision of the conceptual architecture for the domain's intellectual discourse is the intellectual territorial authority that the First Moves Manifesto establishes as its primary and most durable contribution. The manifesto is complete. The intellectual territorial capture is accomplished. The community's intellectual constitution is published. The governing vocabulary's comprehensive prior engagement with the post-corporate transition district's essential character is established in the specific form of the 41 chapters and the 6 appendices and the 8 parts that together constitute the intellectual architecture of the first globally recognized post-corporate transition district's governing framework. What remains, what the manifesto cannot provide and what only the community's genuine practice can generate, is the operational reality that gives the intellectual constitution its evidentiary authority and its cultural weight. The operational reality is built through the beginning. The beginning is available now. The window is open. The territory is established. The community's constitution is published. The practice can begin. The first move is the manifesto. The manifesto has been made. Everything that follows is the community's genuine engagement with the governing framework that the manifesto has established. The specific daily practice of the specific weekly metabolism in the specific physical territory of the specific liminal district by the specific founding cohort of practitioners whose genuine commitment to the genuine practice is the specific human resource that the manifesto's intellectual constitution requires for its operational embodiment. The intellectual constitution is the frame. The practice is the life lived inside the frame. The life lived honestly and genuinely and consistently inside the frame is what the civilization needs. The civilization needs it now. The frame is here. The life is what the practitioners who have read this handbook are being invited, with the specific directness that the governing framework's commitment to operational honesty requires in every dimension of the community's cultural production, including the dimension of the manifesto's own invitation to the practitioners whose response to the invitation is the first move's necessary complement, to begin living. Not tomorrow. Not after the optimal conditions have been assembled. Not after the funding has been secured and the stakeholders have agreed and the founding cohort has reached the target density and the weekly metabolism's logistics have been resolved and the experimental accommodation model's first agreements have been finalized and the social proof infrastructure's documentation discipline has been established and the governing vocabulary has been fully internalized and the dream validation process has been completed and the community's myth production has generated its first Super-Earth universe contribution and the Saturday Atmosphere Nights projection equipment has been acquired and the Sunday integration cenote visit has been organized. Now, in the first available space, with the first available practitioner, in the specific present moment of the reading that has brought the reader to this final sentence of the governing framework's intellectual constitution. The manifesto is complete. The beginning is now. The civilization is what the beginning, practiced genuinely and sustained honestly, eventually produces. That is sufficient reason to begin. Begin. Part 8 complete. The handbook's primary chapters are now complete. Appendices A through F follow. Discussion about this episode. Comments. Restax. Recent episodes. Part 7, the Post-Corporate Transition District. 2 hours ago, MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. Part 6, the Post-Corporate Transition District. 10 hours ago. Part 5, the Post-Corporate Transition District. May 28th, Part 4, the Post-Corporate Transition District. May 27th, Part 3, the Post-Corporate Transition District. May 26th, Part 2, the Post-Corporate Transition District. May 25th, Part 1, the Post-Corporate Transition District. May 25th, Premises. Le Premier District de Transition Post-Corporatif Mondialement Reconnu. May 24th, Copyright 2026 MXTM and Vitsu aka Martin Chartrand.
Welcome to the Post-Corporate Transition District in Aldea Zamá Tulum. This isn't just a retreat, it's a realignment. District, a reorientation zone for high-agency individuals. Leverage our liminal architecture and dream validation framework.
The cage is unlocked, but we choose the bars. Renting our lives, forgetting the source. We are the sovereign authors of this digital verse. Reclaim the dowry, break the curse.
This is the doctrine. The post-platform era demands sovereign authorship. Build the stack. Own
the sovereign authorship dowry. Doctrine for the post-platform era.
NFPs are here. Signed, priced, split, and anchored to a living page. And
this isn't just a token, it's ownership, not access. It's time to take back the real world.
The non-fungible print, NFP. Paper strikes back.
TM Studios, Sovereign Residency and Cultural Partnership Proposal.
Age of the Apes.
The 1%. A post-scarcity transition doctrine.
Gone bad.
A post-scarcity secession doctrine.
Silicon Privateer 2026.
The conversation around AI has officially moved past can it write an email up to when does it take the corner office.
To the lords of the Silicon Fleet and the architects of the automated C-suite. I see you've traded your captains for calculators. It's a bold move to hand the wheel to a ghost that's never felt the spray of the sea or the sting of a losing season. You're betting everything on efficiency, but you've forgotten one thing. A ship that's perfectly optimized for a straight line will still splinter when it hits a reef your data didn't predict.
Destination is civilization. Pirate first.
We went down where the light won't stay, where the world forgets your name.
No signal, no sky to blame, only pressure, only change. We learned how the silence breathes. We learned how the silence breathes, how the deep rewrites believe. No guides in the circuitry, just the weight and what it frees. Hold your breath, let it break you clean. What you were